For over a century, the fields of France and England ran red with the blood of knights, the thunder of charging horses shaking the earth beneath them. But the 100 Years' War was more than just a struggle between kingdoms. It was a grand stage where rivalries became legend, where personal duels between kings and warriors shaped the fate of nations. Think of the mist rolling over Agincourt as arrows darkened the sky, or the fiery defiance of a peasant girl who rallied an army against all odds. These weren't just battles, they were clashes of wills, stories of ambition and vengeance that still echo through history. What made this war unforgettable weren't just the armies or the tactics, but the larger-than-life figures who stood at its heart. Picture Edward the Black Prince, a warrior whose name alone struck fear into his enemies, or Henry V, whose audacity turned the tide of war in a single, rain-soaked charge. Then there's Joan of Arc, a teenager who defied kings and turned the war on its head. Her story alone is a tale of courage that borders on the divine. These weren't just soldiers, they were icons whose rivalries and duels became the stuff of myth. So why do these clashes still captivate us centuries later? Because they're human stories, raw, dramatic, and utterly gripping. A king's pride leading to his downfall, a knight's honor forcing him into a duel against impossible odds, a nation's fate resting on the edge of a sword. Today, we're counting down the 25 greatest duels and rivalries of the 100 Years' War, peeling back the layers of history to reveal the ambition, betrayal, and sheer brilliance that defined this epic conflict. From legendary showdowns to bitter feuds that lasted decades, each story is a piece of the puzzle, one that reshaped Europe forever. So ready your imagination, because we're stepping onto the battlefield. To truly grasp the intensity of these legendary duels, we need to step back into the turbulent world of 14th century Europe, a time when kings ruled by blood and steel, and the line between ambition and destiny was razor thin. The so-called 100 Years' War didn't unfold in a single, continuous clash, but as a series of explosive conflicts, truces, and betrayals stretching across more than a century. At its core, this wasn't just a fight over land, it was a dynastic struggle that pitted two royal houses against each other in a battle for legitimacy. The English Plantagenets, holding vast territories in France, insisted they had just as much right to the French crown as the Valois rulers in Paris. Imagine the tension, two kingdoms locked in a feud where every insult, every broken treaty, every skirmish wasn't just political, it was personal. Warfare itself was evolving during this period, adding another layer to the drama. The age of the armored knight charging across open fields was giving way to new tactics, longbowmen who could rain death from a distance, gunpowder weapons beginning their ominous rumble on the edges of battle. Castles that once seemed impregnable fell to cunning siege strategies, and the very nature of power was shifting. But amid all this change, one thing remained constant: the rivalries between individuals that often decided the course of history. A king's pride could lead to a disastrous campaign. A general's rivalry with his counterpart could turn the tide of war. These weren't just faceless conflicts, they were human stories, where ambition, honor, and vengeance played out on a colossal scale. And that's what makes the duels and clashes we're about to explore so fascinating. They weren't isolated events, but sparks that ignited wider conflagrations. When Edward III claimed the French throne, it wasn't just a legal argument, it was a challenge that echoed across generations, setting the stage for legendary showdowns. When Henry V marched his army into France, he wasn't just fighting for territory, He was stepping into a rivalry that had simmered for decades. Even figures like Joan of Arc didn't emerge from nowhere. They were products of this epic struggle, where the stakes were nothing less than the future of two nations. So as we dive into these stories, remember, behind every clash of swords, there's a deeper story of pride, strategy, and the relentless pursuit of power. When two knights faced each other on the battlefield during the 100 Years' War, it was never just about who was stronger or faster. It was a collision of entire worldviews. The duel, in all its forms, was a mirror reflecting the contradictions of medieval Europe. On one hand, the code of chivalry demanded fair combat, with rules so elaborate they could fill entire books, knights announcing their lineage before a joust or refusing to strike an unarmed opponent. But on the other hand, this was a war where survival often meant bending those rules until they broke. Imagine a French knight in shining armor, trained since childhood to fight with honor, suddenly staring down an English longbowman who had no interest in single combat, just a hail of arrows from 200 yards away. That tension between idealism and brutal pragmatism shaped every duel in this era, whether fought on tournament grounds or blood-soaked battlefields. Take the famous combat of the 30 in 1351, where 30 French knights faced 30 English and Breton fighters in a carefully arranged melee. It was meant to be the ultimate display of chivalry, a fair fight with spectators and agreed-upon rules. Yet even here, the reality of war crept in. When one side began losing, their allies rushed in to break the rules and turn the tide. That moment captures the essence of these duels, the clash between how warfare was supposed to be and how it actually played out. Kings like Edward III understood this perfectly. He used grand tournaments to showcase his knights' skill, knowing these spectacles were as much about intimidating enemies as they were about entertainment. Meanwhile, mercenary captains like John Hawkwood cared little for honor. Their duels were calculated risks, fought for profit rather than glory. What makes these encounters so fascinating is how they reveal the personalities behind the armor. When Bertrand Dugesclin, the famed Breton knight, challenged English commanders to single combat, he wasn't just seeking victory, he was crafting a legend. Each duel became a story that spread through taverns and castles, shaping morale and political alliances. But for every larger-than-life figure like Dugesclin, there were countless unnamed fighters whose duels were matters of life and death with no audience at all. A squire defending his wounded lord in the mud of Poitiers, or a crossbowman dueling a swordsman in the narrow streets of a besieged town. These were the unsung clashes where the war's true stakes became personal. This duality runs through every duel we'll explore. Some were orchestrated spectacles, as carefully staged as a royal coronation. Others were desperate, improvised brawls where the only rule was survival. Yet all of them, from the most celebrated joust to the bloodiest alleyway skirmish, shared one thing. They were human dramas writ large, where courage, fear, and ambition decided the fate of kingdoms. The morning mist clung to the fields near Poitiers on September 19, 1356, as two men prepared to make history, though only one would leave the field victorious. Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince, surveyed his exhausted troops. They were outnumbered nearly 2-1 by the glittering host of French knights under King John II, yet Edward didn't flinch. His father, Edward III, had taught him that battles weren't won by numbers alone, but by wits and will. Across the valley, King John adjusted his crowned helm, convinced this would be the day he crushed the English once and for all. Their duel wasn't just a meeting of swords, it was a collision of philosophies. Edward, the pragmatic strategist, had spent years mastering the art of asymmetrical warfare. John, the embodiment of chivalric idealism, believed God would grant victory to the righteous. What unfolded next became the stuff of legend. Edward positioned his longbowmen on a sloping hillside, their arrows angled to pierce the sky before raining death on the French cavalry. When John's knights charged through the muddy terrain, their horses floundered, turning the charge into chaos. The Black Prince didn't just defend, he orchestrated the battlefield like a chess master, feigning retreat to lure the French into a deadly trap. Meanwhile, John fought like a lion, his personal guard slaughtered around him as he swung his battle axe with desperate fury. Witnesses later swore the king fought on even after his sword shattered, using a dagger against armored opponents. But courage alone couldn't counter Edward's cold calculus. By dusk, the French army was shattered, and John, cornered, wounded, but refusing to yield, became the first French king captured in battle since the days of Charlemagne. The aftermath rippled across Europe like a seismic shock. A king wasn't just a ruler, he was God's anointed, inviolable by tradition. John's capture didn't just embarrass France, it shattered the illusion of royal invincibility. Edward, ever the diplomat as well as a warrior, treated his royal prisoner with lavish courtesy, even serving him dinner on bended knee. Yet the gesture couldn't mask the brutal truth. The Black Prince had outthought, outmaneuvered, and humiliated a reigning monarch. The ransom demanded for John's release, 3 million gold crowns, would cripple France's economy for a generation, but the real cost was psychological. Poitiers proved that the age of unquestioned knightly supremacy was ending, and a new era of tactical innovation had begun. What makes this duel so compelling isn't just the military brilliance or the staggering rants amidst the human drama. Edward, barely 26, already bore the weight of chronic illness that would later claim his life, yet he commanded with the poise of a veteran. John, for all his flaws, embodied the medieval ideal of a warrior king, choosing death before dishonor even in defeat. Their clash at Poitiers wasn't merely a battle, it was a parable about adaptation versus tradition, a lesson that would echo through the rest of the 100 Years' War. Long after the arrows stopped flying, the story of that day would be told in taverns and throne rooms alike, a reminder that in war, even kings bleed. October 25, 1415, dawn broke over the sodden fields of Agincourt to reveal a sight that should have been laughable. On one side stood the cream of French nobility, their polished armor glinting beneath silk surcoats, lances upright like a forest of steel. Opposite them, Henry V's army looked like something scraped from the bottom of a boot. Exhausted, starving men caked in mud, their longbows strung with trembling fingers. The French outnumbered them nearly 5-1, and by all accounts, this wasn't a battle, it was a foregone conclusion. But Henry wasn't just fighting the French that day. He was dueling an entire way of life, a centuries-old belief that noble blood and heavy cavalry decided wars. And what happened next would rewrite the rules of combat forever. The French knights charged through the quagmire, their horses sinking to the knees in soil churned to slurry by overnight rain. It was like watching titans wade through tar, every glorious stride slowed to a nightmare crawl. Then the sky turned black. English longbowmen, positioned on the flanks, loosed volley after volley of arrows arcing high before plunging into the chaos below. Armor that could deflect a sword stroke shattered under the kinetic fury of yard-long arrows fired at point-blank range. Horses screamed, knights toppled into the mud, and the charge dissolved into a grisly traffic jam of fallen men and panicked steeds. The French, trained for honorable combat, had no answer for this slaughter at a distance. Their pride became their coffin. Henry's genius lay in exploiting every weakness of tradition. While French nobles jostled for the glory of capturing enemy knights for ransom, his common soldiers fought with pitiless efficiency. When the French finally reached English lines, those who survived the arrows, they found a wall of poleaxes and men who fought not for honor but survival. The mud, so often dismissed as mere misfortune, became Henry's silent ally. Fallen knights, weighed down by 60 pounds of armor, drowned in puddles barely a foot deep, helpless as peasants clubbed them through their visors. By day's end, over 6,000 French nobles lay dead, including 3 dukes and 90 barons. The flower of French chivalry had been mowed down like wheat. But Agincourt's true impact wasn't measured in body counts, it was psychological. The battle struck a blow to the very idea that noble birth made one invincible. Henry, a king who slept in the same mud as his archers, proved that unity and adaptability could topple an empire's arrogance. The longbow, once mocked as a peasant's weapon, became the great equalizer, rendering generations of knightly training obsolete overnight. And the French, they never forgot the shame. For decades after, chroniclers referred to Agincourt as the accursed day, a wound to their national identity that festered long after the war ended. What makes this duel so iconic isn't just the tactical brilliance or the staggering imbalance of forces. It's the symbolism, a king who embodied the changing world staring down the old order and winning. Henry didn't just defeat an army, he shattered a myth, proving that in war, hunger and ingenuity will always feast on complacency. The mud of Agincourt became the graveyard of chivalric certainty, and the echoes of that lesson would reverberate through every revolution, every upheaval, every time the underdog refused to kneel. Bertrand Dugesclin didn't fight like other knights, and that's precisely why he became a legend. While nobles clashed in glittering armor on open fields, the man they called the Eagle of Brittany preferred the fog of dawn, the hidden forest path, the sudden strike that left enemies bewildered. His rivalry with English commanders like John Chandos wasn't a series of dramatic duels with crossed swords under the gaze of cheering crowds. Instead, it played out in the silent chess game of war. Ambushes sprung from nowhere, supply lines severed like a surgeon's cut, fortresses taken not by brute force but by cunning. Where others saw weakness in retreat, Dugesclin saw opportunity. His greatest weapon wasn't his blade but his mind. Take the siege of Rennes in 1356. While English forces camped outside the city walls, confident in their superiority, Dugesclin turned desperation into theater. He staged a mock brawl in the streets, letting word spread that the defenders were at each other's throats. When the English relaxed their guard, he led a night raid so precise it sliced through their camp like a dagger through parchment. This was his signature, making the enemy's strength their downfall. Chandos, a brilliant strategist in his own right, soon learned to dread the Bretons' unpredictability. Their clashes became a cat-and-mouse game across the French countryside, where every village might hide an ambush, every peasant might be a scout. What set Dugesclin apart wasn't just his tactics, it was his understanding of war's psychological toll. He knew that demoralizing an army could be deadlier than defeating it in battle. After capturing the English stronghold of Poitiers, he didn't just occupy it, he used its own gates against the enemy, trapping them to collapse on reinforcements. Stories of his ingenuity spread like wildfire, each tale making him larger than life. By the time he faced Chandos at the Battle of Cadorate in 1364, the English commander was already wrestling with a ghost, a rival, who seemed to vanish into the landscape only to reappear where least expected. Yet for all his brilliance, Dugesclin's legacy carries a twist of irony. This master of asymmetric warfare eventually became Constable of France, the highest military rank in the kingdom. The man who made his name by refusing to fight on traditional terms was now leading conventional armies and winning. His final campaigns against the English proved he could adapt to any style of combat, but his heart always belonged to the shadows. When he died in 1380, even his enemies mourned. the Eagle of Brittany had shown them something revolutionary. That honor in war wasn't about how you fought, but why. His rivalry with Chandos and others redefined the 100 Years' War, proving that battles weren't just won with lances and longbows, but with deception, patience, and the willingness to rewrite the rules. While kings and princes grabbed headlines, Dugesclin worked in the margins, and in doing so, he changed the game forever. The winter of 1429 had squeezed Orléans in a vise of hunger and despair. For months, English forces had encircled the city, their siege towers looming like skeletal fingers against the sky. Inside the walls, supplies dwindled to rats and melted snow, while beyond the gates, commanders like John Talbot England's feared terror of the French, who waited for surrender to crawl to them on its knees. Then, on a chill March evening, the gates creaked open not to admit defeat, but to reveal a sight that made hardened soldiers scoff. A 17-year-old peasant girl in borrowed armor, her banner stitched with angels. Joan of Arc didn't arrive with fresh troops or secret weapons. She brought something far more dangerous, unshakable faith. What followed wasn't just a military campaign. It was a duel of wills that defied every rule of medieval warfare. Joan's rivals weren't just English archers or knights, but the suffocating weight of tradition. Nobles sneered at taking orders from a farm girl. Priests questioned her visions. Even her own allies hesitated, yet Joan weaponized their doubt. When veteran commanders urged caution, she charged abandoned fortresses under cover of fog. When generals debated tactics, she led the assault herself, climbing ladders under a hail of arrows to plant her standard on enemy walls. Each victory chipped away at English morale while electrifying the French. Talbot, a master of siegecraft, found himself outmaneuvered not by strategy, but by something he couldn't quantify, a girl who fought as if heaven itself guided her sword. The siege climax came at the fortress of Les Tourelles. Wounded by a crossbow bolt to the shoulder, Joan dragged herself back into the fray as dusk fell, rallying troops who'd been retreating. That night, something snapped in the English ranks. After months of dominance, they abandoned their positions in panic, some drowning as they fled across the Loire in darkness. The next morning, Orléans woke to silence where enemy drums had thundered for half a year. Joan's triumph wasn't just tactical, it was alchemical. She'd transformed French shame into fury, English confidence into creeping terror. Yet her greatest strength also sowed the seeds of her downfall. The same divine certainty that shattered the siege made her reckless later at Paris, where she ignored royal orders and attacked without support. The English, humiliated at Orléans, learned from their mistake. When they captured Joan months later, they didn't face her on the battlefield. They dismantled her in a church court, turning her faith against her. But even in chains, she won the psychological duel. Talbot, present at a trial, watched as this illiterate girl outmaneuvered trained theologians for weeks. Her eventual execution only cemented her legend, ensuring that long after the flames at Rouen died, her name would haunt English dreams. What makes this clash so extraordinary isn't just the reversal of fortunes at Orléans, it's how Joan redefined power itself. In an age where bloodline dictated authority, she proved that conviction could move armies. Against the cold calculus of English longbows and stone castles, she wielded something far more disruptive, the unbreakable belief that history could bend to the will of one girl who refused to blink. Centuries later, we still grapple with the mystery of her success. Divine intervention, military genius, or simply the terrifying force of someone who fights not for land or gold, but for a cause beyond mortal reckoning. However you answer, one truth remains. At Orléans, the 100 Years' War stopped being about kings and crowns and became, for a blinding moment, about the courage to defy the impossible. The morning of July 17, 1453, dawned with a metallic tang in the air, the smell of something new and terrible creeping across the fields of Castillon. John Talbot, the grizzled English commander whose name alone had sent French armies retreating for decades, surveyed the enemy positions through narrowed eyes. At 75, he'd spent more years at war than most men had lived, earning his nickname the English Achilles through sheer, unbreakable tenacity. But today, something felt different. The French weren't arrayed in neat ranks of armored knights. Instead, their forces crouched behind a sprawling network of trenches and earthworks, strange bronze shapes glinting ominously between the gaps. Those shapes were cannons, dozens of them, and Talbot, a relic of the old world, was about to charge headlong into the future. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a brutal lesson in obsolescence. Talbot, ever the knight, ordered a frontal assault straight into the teeth of the French guns. His heavy cavalry, trained for generations to smash through infantry lines, became sitting targets as the first volley of cannon fire tore through their ranks like parchment. Horses and riders collapsed in screaming heaps, the concussive blasts flipping armored men like toys. Undeterred, Talbot rallied his survivors for another charge, then another. Each time, the cannons answered with mathematical precision, their iron balls cutting down men who'd spent lifetimes mastering swordsmanship but had no defense against this indiscriminate slaughter. By midday, the field was a charnel house, and Talbot himself lay dying, his leg shattered by a cannonball, his loyal retinue wiped out around him. The irony was as thick as the gunsmoke. Talbot, who'd spent his career as England's unstoppable force, was ultimately broken by the very technology his side had pioneered. English longbows had once revolutionized warfare at Calais and Agincourt. Now, French cannons returned the favor with devastating finality. But Castillon's significance went beyond one man's death. This was the moment gunpowder ceased to be a curiosity and became the undisputed king of the battlefield. The age when a knight's valor could turn the tide was over, replaced by an era where victory went to those who mastered range, logistics, and cold, mechanical efficiency. Yet there's a haunting nobility to Talbot's last stand. In charging those cannons, he wasn't just being stubborn, he was defending an entire way of life. The medieval world, with its chivalric codes and reliance on personal bravery, had no place for weapons that killed anonymously from half a mile away. His death wasn't just the end of a warrior, it was the end of the warrior's world. The French, to their credit, recognized this. They buried Talbot with full honors, his sword laid across his chest in a silent tribute to the old order. Even in defeat, he'd left them a warning: progress marches on, but it always leaves legends in its wake. Castillon didn't just decide the 100 Years' War, it reshaped the very soul of conflict. When the smoke cleared that day, warfare would never again be about individual heroes clashing in the sunlight. The future belonged to engineers, chemists, and tacticians who understood that in the end, courage without adaptation is just a slower way to fall. Talbot's charge became a cautionary tale whispered in military academies for centuries. You can be the greatest lion of your age, but time always brings a sharper tooth. If ever there was a duel fought with whispers instead of swords, it was the decades-long chess match between two men who shared a name but nothing else: Charles the Bad of Navarre and Charles V of France. Their rivalry proves that sometimes the deadliest battles happen in shadowed corridors and secret letters, where a well-placed lie could topple thrones faster than any army. On the surface, they were cousins bound by blood and treaties, but beneath the polite exchanges and royal pageantry, they were scorpions circling one another, each waiting for the other to lower their guard. Charles the Bad earned his ominous nickname through a lifetime of treachery so brazen it became legendary. While other rulers waged war openly, he preferred poison in a rival's cup, bribes slipped to disgruntled barons, or sudden illnesses that conveniently cleared his path to power. His ambitions sprawled far beyond Navarre's borders. He wanted the French crown itself, and he was willing to burn the kingdom down to claim it. Meanwhile, Charles V, though physically frail and plagued by illness, possessed a mind like a steel trap. Known as the Wise, he countered his cousin's schemes not with brute force, but with patience and precision, unraveling plots before they could ignite. Their feud reached its boiling point in 1356, when Charles the Bad orchestrated the assassination of Charles V's trusted constable, a murder so blatant it sparked outrage across France. But instead of marching to war, the French king retaliated with cold calculation. He had Charles the Bad arrested during peace negotiations, a move that shocked Europe's nobility. For a year, the scheming Navarrese ruler rotted in prison while his networks crumbled. Yet even captivity couldn't stifle his ambition. Upon release, he immediately reignited his machinations, this time allying with England's Black Prince, proving that no dungeon could hold a man whose weapon was his silver tongue. What makes their duel so fascinating isn't just the betrayals, it's how their conflict exposed the fragile nature of medieval power. Charles the Bad's alliances shifted with the wind, today's friend becoming tomorrow's pawn. At one point, he even promised territories to both England and France, gambling that chaos would profit him. Meanwhile, Charles V fought fire with ice, using spies and legal decrees to systematically strip his rival's influence. When Navarre's cities rebelled against Charles the Bad's tyranny, the French king subtly supported the revolts, proving that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword. By the time Charles the Bad died in 1387, allegedly poisoned by his own physician, a fitting end for a man who'd mastered the art, his dreams of a greater Navarre lay in ruins. His rival had outmaneuvered him at every turn, not with armies, but with alliances carefully nurtured and traps patiently laid. Their lifelong duel left an indelible lesson. In the Game of Thrones, the reckless schemer rarely outlasts the strategist who plays the long game. While their namesakes would clash on battlefields for generations, these two Charles proved that the sharpest blades were often forged in the shadows. The Breton countryside lay eerily still on March 26, 1351, as 60 knights, 30 Breton, 30 English took their positions on a field near Plyamel. This was no ordinary skirmish, but something far more theatrical. The Combat of the 30, a staged melee designed to settle regional tensions through controlled, chivalric violence. Spectators gathered along the edges, nobles and peasants alike, expecting a glorious display of martial skill. The rules were clear: no projectiles, no outside interference, just 60 men fighting until one side yielded or could fight no more. What unfolded, however, was less a pageant of honor than a raw glimpse into the contradictions of medieval warfare. At first, the combat lived up to its romantic billing. Knights paired off like dancers, their swords ringing against shields in rhythmic clashes. Heraldry shimmered in the afternoon light as combatants shouted their lineages before engaging, adhering to the elaborate etiquette of single combat. But as hours passed and exhaustion set in, the veneer of civility cracked. Wounded men stumbled, only to be trampled underfoot. A Breton knight, Robert de Beaumanoir, famously refused water despite bleeding from multiple wounds, growling that he'd drink only from English blood today. The line between spectacle and slaughter blurred with every fallen fighter. By dusk, 12 lay dead, and nearly all survivors bore grievous injuries, proof that even the most carefully choreographed duel couldn't tame war's inherent savagery. What makes this clash so revealing isn't just the body count, it's how quickly ideals crumbled under pressure. The English side, initially praised for their discipline, eventually broke formation and rushed the Bretons in desperation when the tide turned against them. Meanwhile, Breton squires, sworn to remain passive observers, couldn't resist joining the fray to protect their masters, turning the fair fight into a chaotic brawl. Both sides violated their own rules, proving that in the heat of battle, survival instinct overrides even the most sacred codes. Yet paradoxically, the very brutality elevated the event into legend. Chroniclers omitted the messy details, weaving the combat of the 30 into a parable of knightly virtue, a testament to how desperately medieval society clung to the myth of honorable warfare, even as reality repeatedly proved otherwise. The aftermath rippled far beyond that bloodied field. The surviving Bretons were celebrated as heroes, their victory touted as divine favor, while the defeated English became cautionary tales about the perils of pride. But beneath the propaganda, a darker lesson lingered. If even staged combat between knights could descend into butchery, what did that say about the 100-year conflict raging across France? The combat of the 30 became a microcosm of the war itself, a clash where lofty ideals collided with human nature's baser instincts, leaving both sides permanently altered. Centuries later, we remember it not for its chivalric pageantry, but for the uncomfortable truth it exposed, that no amount of rules or rituals can fully civilize the act of war. Few battles capture the essence of tactical brilliance quite like the skirmish at Cadorate in 1347, where an English knight named Thomas Dagworth faced off against Charles of Blois in a clash that would reshape Brittany's future. On paper, the odds were laughable. Dagworth commanded a handful of men, perhaps a few hundred at most, while Charles led a force 3 times that size, backed by the might of French nobility. But Dagworth wasn't playing by the old rules. While Charles prepared for a conventional confrontation, the English knight turned the Breton countryside itself into his ally, using dense forests and narrow lanes to negate his enemy's numerical advantage. The duel unfolded like a predator ambushing its prey. Dagworth's forces struck in a sudden, coordinated assault, their mobility allowing them to hit hard and vanish before the French could regroup. Charles, accustomed to the slow, methodical marches of traditional warfare, found himself outmaneuvered at every turn. His knights, weighed down by heavy armor, floundered in the uneven terrain, while Dagworth's lighter troops danced around them, picking off stragglers and disrupting formations. When the dust settled, Charles of Blois, a man who'd spent years fighting to claim Brittany as his own, was dragged from his horse and taken prisoner, a humiliation that resonated far beyond that patch of Breton soil. What makes this victory so remarkable isn't just the capture of a high-ranking noble, but the sheer audacity of Dagworth's strategy. He proved that battles weren't always won by the biggest army, but by the cleverest commander. By refusing to engage on Charles's terms, he exposed the fragility of traditional medieval tactics when faced with adaptability. The fall of Charles didn't just hand England a political victory, it sent a message that the old ways of war were no longer enough. Yet the true legacy of Cadorate lies in its ripple effects. With Charles imprisoned, the pro-English faction in Brittany gained unstoppable momentum, securing the region for years to come. Dagworth's triumph became a blueprint for future commanders, showing how mobility and surprise could overturn even the most lopsided odds. It was a lesson the English would take to heart in campaigns to come, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the fields of Agincourt. In the grand tapestry of the 100 Years' War, Cadorate might seem like a minor thread, but that's precisely why it matters. Not every turning point comes on a famous battlefield. Sometimes history pivots in the quiet moments, when a resourceful leader looks at the rules of war and decides to rewrite them. The walls of Calais groaned under the weight of desperation in the winter of 1346. Inside the city, hollow-eyed citizens chewed on leather belts and boiled wallpaper for sustenance. Outside, Edward III's English army sat like wolves circling a dying stag, their siege engines silent not out of mercy, but because they no longer needed them. This wasn't war as the bards sang of it, no clashing swords, no heroic charges. This was a slower, more intimate kind of duel, a battle of wills between a king and a city that refused to kneel. For 11 grueling months, Calais held out, its defenders clinging to the hope that French reinforcements would break the stranglehold. But as the weeks passed and the food stores vanished, their defiance became something more tragic, a test of how much suffering human pride could endure. The breaking point came in August 1347, when 6 of Calais' wealthiest burghers emerged from the gates barefoot, ropes around their necks, offering their lives in exchange for the city's survival. This moment, immortalized later in Rodin's haunting sculpture, wasn't just an act of sacrifice, it was psychological warfare turned inside out. The burghers knew Edward wanted more than victory. He wanted submission served on a platter of humiliation. By presenting themselves as willing martyrs, they forced the king into an impossible choice: execute them, and he'd be remembered as a butcher; spare them, and he risked looking weak. The tension in that moment was thicker than the siege walls themselves, a silent duel where the weapons were reputation and public perception. What happened next reveals the contradictions of medieval warfare. Edward, known for his ruthless pragmatism, initially vowed to hang the burghers as an example, but his queen, Philippa of Hainault, intervened with a masterstroke of political theatre. Falling to her knees, a queen begging before her own husband, she twisted the narrative. Now, mercy wouldn't signal weakness. It would showcase Edward's magnanimity, his capacity to be moved by noble sentiment. The king's eventual pardon of the burghers wasn't just an act of compassion. It was a calculated move to preserve his image as a chivalric ruler rather than a vengeful conqueror. This siege, often overshadowed by flashier battles, holds a mirror to the 100 Years' War's deeper truths. Calais wasn't just a military target, it was a symbol. For Edward, capturing this last French stronghold in the north meant securing a strategic foothold, a dagger pointed at France's heart. For the citizens, resisting against impossible odds became a point of honor that transcended survival. The burghers' sacrifice and Edward's reluctant mercy exposed the fragile dance between brutality and reputation that defined medieval leadership, yet the aftermath carried its own irony. Though spared, the burghers watched as Edward expelled most of Calais' population, replacing them with English settlers, a quiet ethnic cleansing that gets lost in the romanticized version of the story. The siege's legacy, like so much in this war, is a tapestry of light and shadow. It reminds us that even in an age of swords and castles, the most enduring battles were often fought not with steel, but with the weight of choices, and that sometimes the greatest duels leave no bodies on the field at all. The Black Prince's chevauchée through France in 1356 wasn't just a military campaign. It was a psychological masterclass in turning terrain into a weapon. With a force of no more than 6,000 men, Edward of Woodstock didn't march to conquer cities or hold territory. Instead, his riders fanned out like a plague of locusts, burning crops, torching villages, and vanishing before French forces could respond. Each smoldering field was a calculated insult, each ruined granary a blow to King John II's legitimacy. The English weren't just fighting an army, they were dismantling an entire kingdom's ability to wage war, one harvest at a time. What made these raids so devastating was their surgical precision. The Black Prince's troops moved with a speed that defied medieval logistics, covering 30 miles a day, unthinkable for an army burdened by supply wagons. They struck where least expected, avoiding fortified strongholds to ravage undefended countryside instead. French chroniclers wrote of entire regions reduced to a sea of ashes, their populations fleeing to walled towns that soon overflowed with starving refugees. This wasn't random violence, it was economic sabotage on a grand scale. By destroying the very resources that fed French armies and filled royal coffers, the chevauchés choked off King John's capacity to fight back. But the true brilliance of the strategy lay in its psychological trap. The Black Prince knew French nobility couldn't endure the humiliation of standing idle while their lands burned. Chivalric duty demanded response, no matter the cost, so when King John finally mustered an overwhelming force to corner the English near Poitiers, he wasn't just making a tactical error, he was playing directly into Edward's hands. The French, weighed down by heavy armor and righteous fury, charged uphill through a bottleneck of muddy terrain, while English longbowmen turned the sky black with arrows. The chevauchée had done its work long before the first arrow flew. By forcing the French to attack on unfavorable ground, the Black Prince turned their pride into their downfall. Yet the legacy of these raids extends far beyond Poitiers' bloodied fields. The chevauchée redefined what victory meant in medieval warfare. No longer was war solely about capturing castles or killing knights, it was about breaking an enemy's will and means to resist. The Black Prince demonstrated that sometimes the most effective duel isn't fought against soldiers, but against the fragile systems that sustain them: farms, trade routes, and the trust between rulers and ruled. In the end, the chevauché's greatest damage couldn't be measured in burned villages or ransom payments. It shattered the myth of French invincibility, proving that even the wealthiest kingdom could be bled dry by a determined foe. And for the English, it offered a grim blueprint, one they'd return to again and again, each raid a reminder that in total war, the land itself is a battlefield. Louis I of Anjou didn't just inherit a title, he inherited a war zone where loyalty was measured in silver. By the 1360s, vast stretches of France had become a playground for mercenary bands like the infamous Great Company, ruthless fighters who owed allegiance to no crown but their own greed. These weren't knights bound by chivalry or peasants pressed into service. They were entrepreneurs of violence, selling their swords to the highest bidder and turning entire regions into their personal fiefdoms. When Louis marched south to secure his lands, he wasn't facing an army. He was confronting a hydra of shifting alliances, where today's ally could become tomorrow's plunderer. The Great Company operated like a shadow kingdom. Led by hardened captains like John Hawkwood, they extorted protection payments from towns, held nobles for ransom, and even negotiated treaties as if they were sovereign powers. Their strength lay in their mobility, striking fast, then melting into the countryside before royal forces could respond. Louis, a prince of the blood, found himself outmaneuvered by men who saw war not as a duty, but as a profit margin. His attempts to crush them faltered not from lack of courage, but because the rules had changed. Traditional sieges and pitched battles meant nothing to mercenaries who simply refused to stand and fight unless the odds favored them. What makes this duel so revealing is how it exposes the war's underbelly. While kings and chroniclers obsessed over grand battles, the real struggle for control often happened in the murky space between nations and banditry. The Great Company didn't care whether England or France won. They thrived on the chaos between victories. At one point, they even offered their services to both sides simultaneously, playing the conflict like a chessboard where every move turned a profit. Louis's frustration grew as he realized he couldn't defeat them militarily. He had to outbid them, offering pardons and pensions to lure fighters back into the fold. Yet the mercenaries' legacy outlasted the war itself. their tactics living off the land, leveraging terror as a weapon, treating war as a trade, foreshadowed the rise of professional armies centuries later. In their amorality, they were shockingly modern. Louis eventually managed to pacify some bands through a mix of bribes and brute force, but the lesson lingered. When money fuels war, even princes can't always dictate terms. His struggle against the Great Company wasn't just a sideshow, it was a glimpse into warfare's future, where the line between soldier and mercenary would blur beyond recognition. The morning of June 24, 1340, dawned with an unnatural quiet over the harbor of Sluys, the calm before a storm of timber and iron. Edward III's English fleet, a motley assembly of merchant ships hastily converted for war, floated like ghosts in the mist, their sails limp in the still air. Across the water, the French navy lay anchored in arrogant formation, their galleys bristling with crossbowmen and their decks crowded with knights in full plate. On paper, it was a mismatch. The French outnumbered the English nearly 2-1, their ships taller, their crews seasoned by Mediterranean campaigns. But Edward wasn't playing by the old rules of naval warfare. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was a slaughterhouse on the waves, and the first proof that England's fate in the 100 Years' War would be decided as much by sea as by land. Traditional naval tactics favored maneuver and ranged combat, with galleys ramming or boarding at a distance, but Edward, ever the innovator, turned his ships into floating castles. He packed them with longbowmen, their deadly arrows capable of punching through armor at 200 yards, and ordered his vessels lashed together to create stable platforms. When the French closed in, expecting a conventional melee, they were met with a hailstorm of arrows so thick it blotted out the sun. Knights toppled into the water like lead weights, their armor turning their falls into death sentences. The English, meanwhile, fought with grim efficiency, using grappling hooks to drag French ships close enough for hand-to-hand combat where their disciplined infantry held the advantage. By dusk, the harbor was a floating graveyard. French corpses bobbed between shattered hulls, their blood staining the tide crimson. Of the nearly 200 French ships, only a handful escaped. Edward's victory was so complete that chroniclers claimed a man could walk from one side of the harbor to the other, stepping only on wreckage. But Sluys wasn't just a tactical triumph, it was strategic genius. With the French navy obliterated, England gained unchallenged control of the English Channel. Troops, supplies, and reinforcements could now flow freely between England and its continental holdings, while French coastal towns lived in terror of sudden raids. The battle's legacy rippled far beyond that bloody day. Sluys proved that naval supremacy could dictate the course of a land war, a lesson that would echo through centuries of British military strategy. It also exposed a fatal flaw in French thinking. Their obsession with knightly grandeur had blinded them to the changing face of warfare. While they'd built a navy to carry nobles to glory, Edward had built one to win. The sea, once a moat protecting France from invasion, had become a highway for English ambition, and the first of many theaters where the 100 Years' War would be won or lost. The feud between the Armagnacs and Burgundians wasn't just a political squabble, it was a slow-motion suicide that tore France apart from the inside. While English armies marched across their countryside, French nobles turned on each other with a venom that made foreign invaders seem almost polite. On one side stood the Armagnacs, loyal to the mad King Charles VI and led by his ruthless brother Louis of Orléans. Arrayed against them were the Burgundians, commanded by John the Fearless, a man whose nickname belied the cold, calculating ambition burning beneath his surface. Their rivalry wasn't about ideology or even the English threat. It was about who would pull the strings of a kingdom teetering on the brink. The spark came in 1407, when John's assassins ambushed Louis in a Paris street, stabbing him to death as he dismounted from his horse. This wasn't some back-alley murder. It happened in broad daylight with a brutality meant to send a message. The killing shattered any pretense of unity, splitting France into armed camps that spent more energy fighting each other than resisting English occupation. Towns changed hands not through siege but betrayal, as local lords switched allegiances based on who offered the better bribe. The Burgundians even formed temporary alliances with the English, inviting Henry V's troops into Paris as protectors against their Armagnac rivals. It was like watching a man set his own house on fire to spite his brother. What makes this civil war so tragic is how needless it all was. While nobles jockeyed for power, peasants bore the brunt of their feud. Armagnac and Burgundian militias ravaged the countryside with equal ferocity, burning villages suspected of leaning toward the other side. Chroniclers wrote of roads lined with impaled heads, entire regions where no crop grew because the farmers had all fled or been slaughtered. The chaos got so bad that at one point, both factions hired the same mercenary bands, meaning French gold paid for soldiers who switched uniforms depending on which side offered more that week. England didn't just exploit this division, it feasted on it. Henry V's victories at Agincourt and elsewhere weren't just military triumphs. They were the inevitable result of fighting an enemy already bleeding itself dry. The Armagnacs and Burgundians were so busy settling scores that they left gaping holes in France's defenses, holes the English marched through at will. Even after Joan of Arc temporarily united the factions, the scars never fully healed. Distrust lingered like a poison, flaring up again whenever crisis loomed. In the end, their feud taught a brutal lesson. No kingdom falls solely because of external enemies. The real danger comes when those who should stand together decide that personal power matters more than survival. The Armagnacs and Burgundians didn't just weaken France, they showed how easily pride can turn allies into architects of their own ruin. By 1364, the fate of Brittany had become a tangled knot of ambition and bloodshed, one that would finally be cut on the rain-slicked fields outside Auray. Two men stood at the center of this decades-long struggle: John of Montfort, the English-backed claimant with fire in his veins, and Charles of Blois, the French-supported rival whose piety couldn't mask his hunger for power. Their clash wasn't just another skirmish in the 100 Years' War. It was a microcosm of the entire conflict, where local loyalties and foreign meddling collided with brutal consequences. The morning of September 29th dawned with both armies arrayed in grim silence. Montfort's forces, though fewer in number, were hardened by years of guerrilla warfare under commanders like the infamous John Chandos. They fought not just for territory, but for survival. Their English allies had made it clear that defeat meant exile or worse. Across the field, Blois's larger host glittered with French knights, their armor polished for what they assumed would be a triumphant procession rather than a battle. But Blois had underestimated his opponent's desperation. Montfort's troops anchored their flanks against the river and a fortified abbey, forcing the French to attack head-on through a killing zone of English longbows and disciplined infantry. What unfolded was less a duel of tactics than a test of wills. Blois, ever the chivalric idealist, led charge after charge into the teeth of Montfort's defenses, his knights bogging down in the marshy ground. Chandos, the tactical mastermind on Montfort's side, exploited every misstep, his archers raining death while Breton pikemen held the line with grim determination. When Blois finally fell, run through by an English lance, his death wasn't just the end of a man. It was the collapse of a cause. The French ranks shattered, their dreams of controlling Brittany drowning in the mud alongside their leader. Auray's aftermath rippled far beyond the battlefield. With Blois dead, the Treaty of Guérande finally recognized Montfort as Brittany's rightful duke, but the victory came with strings attached. England's influence grew exponentially, turning the region into a dagger pointed at France's western flank. Yet the real lesson of Auray was subtler. In an age of proxy wars, local conflicts could alter the course of empires. The battle proved that even a single regional duel, fought over what seemed like petty inheritance disputes, could tilt the balance of the 100 Years' War. What makes this clash so emblematic isn't just the bloodshed or the political realignment, it's the way it exposed the war's fractal nature. Like cracks in glass, the larger conflict splintered into countless smaller rivalries, each one reflecting the whole. Auray reminded kings and commoners alike that in this new era of warfare, there were no sidelines, only front lines waiting to be drawn. The fields near Nagera ran crimson on April 3, 1367, as two of the century's greatest warriors collided in a battle that was anything but straightforward. Edward the Black Prince, already a legend for his victories at Poitiers and elsewhere, had marched his army across the Pyrenees to intervene in Castile's civil war, not for glory but for cold, hard cash. His opponent, Bertrand Dugesclin, the crafty Breton commander who'd spent years outmaneuvering the English in France, now found himself defending a usurper's shaky throne. What unfolded wasn't just a clash of armies, but a masterclass in medieval warfare's brutal elegance, where every charge and countercharge carried the weight of kingdoms. The Black Prince's forces were a tapestry of European ambition, English longbowmen, Gascon knights, even exiled Castilian nobles hungry for revenge. Dugesclin, ever the pragmatist, had fortified his position behind a dry riverbed, forcing the English to attack uphill. But the prince, sensing his adversary's plan, turned the terrain against him. Instead of a reckless frontal assault, he feigned a retreat, luring the French and their Castilian allies into abandoning their defenses. When Dugesclin's knights surged forward, they met a storm of arrows so thick it seemed the very air had turned to steel. Then came the counterstroke, the Black Prince's heavy cavalry, crashing into their disorganized ranks like a hammer onto an anvil. For all its tactical brilliance, Nagera was less a battle than a series of duels writ large. Knights on both sides sought out worthy opponents, their personal rivalries playing out amidst the chaos. One Castilian noble reportedly fought his way through 30 men to reach a traitorous cousin, their duel continuing even as the battle raged around them. Dugesclin himself was captured after a ferocious last stand, his sword shattered but his defiance unbroken. The Black Prince, ever the chivalric idealist, allegedly greeted his battered foe with a cup of wine, a moment of respect between enemies who understood each other all too well. Yet Nagera's glittering victory hid a darker truth. The campaign had drained the prince's coffers dry, his army ravaged more by dysentery than enemy blades. The gold he'd been promised for supporting Castile's rightful king never materialized, leaving him to limp back to Aquitaine with empty pockets and a diminished force. Dugesclin, meanwhile, was ransomed and freed within months, returning to France more dangerous than ever. The battle proved a paradox, a tactical masterpiece that became a strategic millstone. The prince had won every engagement but lost the campaign, his health and finances broken by the Spanish sun. What makes Nagera so haunting isn't the fighting, it's the lesson etched in its aftermath. In war, even the most dazzling victories can sow the seeds of defeat. The Black Prince's intervention in Spain weakened England's position in France, while Dugesclin's survival ensured the French resistance would only grow sharper. Like two knights dealing mortal wounds to each other in a mutual charge, both sides walked away from Nagera limping, their triumph and tragedy forever entwined. The throne room of Westminster in 1422 should have been a place of triumph. England's infant king, Henry VI, crowned as the first monarch to claim both English and French crowns by blood and treaty. Yet the air hung heavy with unease. Across the Channel, another boy king, Charles VII of France, lurked in the shadows of his own fractured kingdom, dismissed by his enemies as the King of Burghers for his pitiful domain. Their rivalry would become one of the strangest duels in history, a clash fought not on battlefields, but in council chambers and peasant huts, where the true weapons were not swords, but whispers, wills, and the crushing weight of legacy. Henry inherited an empire forged by his warrior father and grandfather, but their iron resolve had skipped a generation. Plagued by bouts of madness and swayed by squabbling nobles, he presided over England's slow-motion collapse in France like a sleepwalker unaware of the cliff's edge. Taxes meant to fund armies vanished into aristocratic pockets. Commanders like John Talbot fought valiantly but found their supply lines cut by parliamentary indifference. Meanwhile, Charles, once so timid that his own mother claimed he was illegitimate, underwent a metamorphosis. With Joan of Arc's fiery inspiration and the bureaucratic genius of ministers like Jacques Coeur, he rebuilt France from the ashes. His court became a magnet for talent, his treasury refilled through shrewd trade deals, and his armies retook towns not just by siege, but by convincing their citizens that loyalty to France meant bread on their tables. The contrast between these kings crystallized in Normandy's loss. English held for decades, the region slipped away not through some climactic battle, but through 1,000 small betrayals. French agents spread rumors that Henry's rule meant endless war taxes, while Charles promised pardons and lowered tariffs. When Rouen, the linchpin of English Normandy, finally opened its gates in 1449 without a fight, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was proof that Charles had won the duel where it mattered most, in the hearts of people who no longer saw the English as inevitable. Yet the cruelest twist lay in timing. Just as Henry's weakness lost France, Charles's newfound strength outlived its purpose. By the war's end, the French king had become so paranoid about sharing power that he alienated the very allies who'd saved his throne. His duel with Henry wasn't just a tale of resurgence against collapse, it was a warning. Leadership in war isn't just about the battles you win, but the peace you build. Charles reclaimed a kingdom, but the seeds of future strife, nobles embittered by his ingratitude, provinces simmering under heavy taxes, would bloom into the chaos of the wars of religion. As for Henry, he returned to England to face his own nightmares, a king who'd lost 2 crowns because he never understood that the hardest fights don't always need a sword. The clash between French crossbowmen and English longbowmen wasn't just a difference of weapons, it was a collision of worlds. On one side stood the crossbow, a marvel of medieval engineering, its steel-reinforced arms capable of punching bolts through armor at 100 paces with mechanical precision. On the other, the humble longbow, a 6-foot curve of yew that could launch arrows in arcs so dense they blotted out the sun. Each weapon told a story about the society that wielded it. The crossbow was the aristocrat's choice, expensive, requiring years of training to maintain, and best used by professional soldiers who could afford its intricate maintenance. The longbow was the people's weapon, cheap to make, lethal in the hands of a peasant with enough strength to draw its 100-pound pull, and devastating when deployed en masse. The rivalry reached its bloody crescendo at Crécy in 1346. There, Geno's crossbowmen in French service found themselves outmatched not by superior skill, but by sheer volume. English longbowmen, positioned on high ground, loosed arrows at a rate of 10 per minute compared to the crossbow's sluggish 2. Worse, a sudden downpour soaked the Genos bowstrings, rendering them useless, while the English simply unstrung their longbows to keep the cords dry. When the Genoese retreated in disarray, French knights, disdainful of the mercenaries, rode them down in their frustration. It was a disaster born of cultural as much as tactical differences. The French nobility's mistrust of common-born soldiers meeting the cold efficiency of England's yeoman archers. Yet the crossbow story doesn't end in humiliation. While the longbow reigned supreme in open battle, the crossbow found its niche in the shadows. Sieges, ambushes, and urban fighting favored its silent, single-shot lethality. Crossbowmen could perch on castle walls, picking off attackers with pinpoint accuracy, or stalk forests where the longbow's range meant little. In the hands of specialists like the Gascon mercenaries, it became a tool of psychological terror. A single bolt through a commander's visor could collapse an entire assault. Even at Agincourt, where longbows once again shredded French charges, crossbowmen played a pivotal role in the initial skirmishing, their bolts forcing English troops to tighten formations before the main engagement. What makes this duel so fascinating is how it defies simple conclusions. The longbow's dominance on famous battlefields obscures the crossbow's stubborn persistence in 100 smaller clashes. Like two languages competing for supremacy, each weapon flourished where its strengths mattered most. The longbow needed open fields and massed ranks. The crossbow thrived in tight spaces and patient, calculated strikes. By the war's end, gunpowder would render both obsolete, but their rivalry left an indelible mark on warfare. It proved that no weapon fades quietly. It adapts, lingers, and fights for relevance until the very last arrow finds its mark. The candlelit alleys of medieval Europe teemed with shadows that spoke in code where a whispered phrase or a scrap of parchment could tilt the scales of war more decisively than any cavalry charge. While kings and knights clashed on sunlit battlefields, another duel raged in tavern backrooms and moonlit crossroads, waged by men and women whose names history often forgot. These were the spies of the 100 Years' War, masters of a craft where a well-placed lie could topple fortresses and a single betrayal could unravel years of strategy. Their weapons weren't swords but stolen seals, forged letters, and the art of making the invisible hand guide history. Take the weeks before Agincourt, when Henry V's network of scouts and informants intercepted French plans detailing their troop movements and supply routes. That intelligence wasn't just helpful, it was transformative. Knowing exactly where the enemy would strike allowed Henry to position his outnumbered forces on terrain that neutralized France's advantages, turning a potential massacre into one of history's most lopsided victories. But this was no isolated incident. Spies like Jehan de Bois, a double agent who fed false troop numbers to French commanders, or the mysterious Green Woman of Calais, who smuggled English messages past besieging forces in hollowed-out loaves of bread, operated with a daring that would make modern espionage agencies blush. The methods were as ingenious as they were ruthless. Ciphers disguised as merchant ledgers, ink that vanished when heated, even carrier pigeons with tiny scrolls tucked under their wings. All were tools in a shadow war where information was currency. Assassinations, though rare, weren't unheard of. The poisoning of a Burgundian courier in 1421 deprived the French of critical alliance documents, while the sudden illness of an English paymaster in Normandy left entire garrisons unpaid and mutinous. More often, though, spies worked through patience and persuasion. A bribe to a castle gatekeeper here, a romantic liaison with a noble secretary there. Each small betrayal stacked the deck for the battles everyone would remember. What makes this hidden duel so fascinating is how it blurred the lines between honor and pragmatism. Knights might scoff at subterfuge, but their kings quietly funded networks of informants. The French even established the first organized intelligence bureau under Charles V, staffed by monks skilled in cryptography. Yet for every success, there were spectacular failures. In 1370, a captured English spy named Thomas Catton swallowed a coded letter rather than reveal it under torture, only for the French to force an emetic down his throat and recover the soggy, half-digested message. The war's outcome often hinged on such grotesque vignettes, where loyalty and desperation collided in the dark. Beyond tactics, this espionage war reveals a deeper truth. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought with swords and siege engines, but with whispers and wit. A well-timed rumor could demoralize an army faster than any defeat in the field. A forged order could convince a garrison to open its gates without a single arrow being loosed. While history books immortalize the thunder of Agincourt or the flames of Orléans, the silent victories of spies shaped those battles long before the first sword was drawn. Their legacy lingers in every modern intelligence service, a reminder that even in an age of chivalry, the sharpest weapon was often the unseen one. The Treaty of Bratigny in 1360 should have been a triumph. After decades of bloodshed, England's Edward III and France's John II finally sat down to carve up their grievances with quills instead of swords. On parchment, it looked like a masterstroke. Edward renounced his claim to the French throne in exchange for vast territories, while King John's ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, enough to bankrupt France twice over. But treaties, like swords, have two edges. What seemed like an end to hostilities was really just a pause, one that gave both sides time to nurse their wounds and their grudges. The moment the ink dried, the loopholes began to unravel. Edward kept the title King of France in personal documents, a quiet provocation. The French, meanwhile, dragged their feet on payments, counting the days until they could reclaim what they'd lost. Diplomacy in the 100 Years' War was less about peace than it was about reloading. Take the Truce of Calais in 1347, brokered after the city's brutal surrender. For 9 years it held on paper, but in the shadows both sides stockpiled weapons, trained troops, and wooed each other's disgruntled nobles. The truce didn't end the conflict, it professionalized it. Like boxers between rounds, England and France used these pauses to study their opponent's weaknesses. When fighting resumed, the blows were sharper, the strategies more calculated. Even the most solemn oaths crumbled under ambition. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which declared Henry V heir to France, was celebrated with royal weddings and feasts, only to be torn apart within a generation by Joan of Arc's revolt and Charles VII's resurgence. The real betrayal, though, wasn't in the broken treaties, it was in the way they weaponized trust. After Bratigny, French peasants in ceded territories woke to find their new English overlords demanding taxes to fund the next war. Local truces, like the ones brokered by mercenaries tired of unpaid wages, often collapsed when one side realized the other was starving. Diplomacy became a shell game where every handshake hid a dagger. The Cardinal of Winchester's secret negotiations with Burgundy in the 1420s didn't just undermine English morale, they proved that in this war, even the Church played both sides. What makes these paper duels so gripping is their lingering poison. A battlefield defeat could heal in a decade, but a treaty's broken promise festered for generations. The English never forgot the lands they'd been promised and never received. The French seethed at humiliations like the Treaty of London in 1358, which reduced their king to a vassal. Each agreement wasn't an ending, but a prologue, one that ensured the next clash would be fought with fresher hatred. In the 100 Years' War, the pen didn't just write history, it sharpened the swords for the next act. The war that would span generations didn't begin with a battle cry or a siege, it started in the dry, ink-stained pages of legal texts. Edward III's claim to the French throne was no impulsive land grab. It was a meticulously crafted argument, rooted in his mother Isabella's lineage as daughter of Philip IV. But France's Salic law, an ancient legal code, stood like an iron gate against his ambitions. This obscure statute, dusted off and brandished by French lawyers, declared that no part of the inheritance may pass through a woman, a single sentence that would drown Europe in blood for a century. What followed wasn't just a war of armies, but a duel of documents where genealogies became weapons and courtroom precedents carried the weight of cavalry charges. The brilliance and tragedy of this legal duel lay in its impossibility. Edward's claim wasn't frivolous. By the complex web of medieval inheritance customs outside France, he had a legitimate case. His Plantagenet ancestors had ruled more of France than the Valois kings for generations, but the French crown countered with Salic law's unyielding logic, painting Edward as a foreign upstart grasping at technicalities. Neither side could afford to back down because surrender meant more than lost territory. It meant admitting their entire dynastic legitimacy was a fraud. Every battle from Crecy to Agincourt was, in essence, a violent footnote to this unresolved legal debate. Yet the dispute's real poison was its flexibility. When Edward needed English support, he framed his claim as a righteous quest to restore stolen birthright. When French morale wavered, their kings invoked Salic law as sacred tradition, painting resistance as patriotic duty. The rules changed depending on who held the pen. French heralds quietly ignored Salic law when it suited them, like allowing women to inherit fiefs in Aquitaine. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on observers. The poet Eustache Deschamps mocked both sides, writing that laws are like spider webs strong enough to trap flies but torn apart by birds of prey. What makes this paper duel so fascinating is how it shaped the war's brutality. Unlike conflicts fought purely for land or plunder, this was a war of existential legitimacy. Neither side could fully conquer the other, but neither could tolerate the other's existence. The English couldn't accept being mere dukes of Aquitaine under French authority. The French couldn't survive an English king in Paris undermining their entire feudal order. It's why truces collapsed and massacres became routine, because at its core, the 100 Years' War wasn't just a fight for territory, but for the right to exist as a sovereign power. The legacy of this legal clash outlasted the battlefields. Salic law, once an obscure regional custom, became a cornerstone of French national identity, invoked for centuries to block foreign claims. England's eventual abandonment of the French crown title in 1801 wasn't just diplomatic pragmatism. It was the final admission that some duels, no matter how fiercely fought, can only end when both sides stop keeping score. The streets of Rouen in 1418 were a theater of slow, grinding horror, a place where hunger became a weapon and desperation the only currency. For 6 months, the English siege tightened like a noose around the city's throat. Citizens ate dogs, then rats, then boiled leather from their own shoes. Children's cries faded into silence as starvation hollowed out entire families. Yet this wasn't just one tragic siege. It was a pattern repeated across the 100 Years' War, where cities like Bordeaux, Calais, and Orléans transformed into battlegrounds more brutal than any open field. Urban warfare in this era wasn't about glorious charges or nightly duels. It was a test of endurance where the real combatants were often shopkeepers, craftsmen, and mothers counting crumbs. What made these sieges so uniquely cruel was their asymmetry. Behind fortified walls, civilians endured conditions no army would tolerate. In Bordeaux during the 1350s, survivors resorted to eating grass and tree bark, while the English blockaders feasted on stolen livestock just beyond arrow range. Disease thrived in the cramped quarters, with dysentery and typhus killing more than enemy arrows. Yet paradoxically, these suffering populations held more power than they knew. A city's decision to resist or surrender could alter the course of the war. When Rouen finally opened its gates, it wasn't because its walls had fallen. It was because the people, pushed beyond human limits, forced their leaders to negotiate. Their resilience, or lack of it, became the true measure of victory. The strategies of urban combat revealed war's ugly pragmatism. Besiegers employed psychological terror alongside brute force, catapulting rotting carcasses over walls to spread disease or using sappers to undermine entire neighborhoods. Defenders countered with grim ingenuity, like the citizens of Orléans who repurposed church bells as early warning systems, or the Bordelais who dug secret tunnels to smuggle in grain. Neither side fought clean. Starvation tactics blurred the line between soldier and civilian, making every baker's oven a strategic target and every child's whimper a weapon of morale. Yet within this darkness flickered moments of startling humanity. Chronicles tell of besiegers sharing bread with emaciated children during truces, or enemy commanders allowing women and the elderly to flee before the final assault. These weren't acts of mercy so much as calculated moves. Warriors on both sides understood that controlling a city required more than broken gates. It demanded at least the illusion of compassion to quell future rebellions. The legacy of these urban duels lingers in the very stones of surviving medieval cities. Walk the ramparts of Carcassonne or the cobbled lanes of Old Rouen, and you're tracing the scars of a war fought house by house, cellar by cellar. It's a reminder that while kings and knights dominate the history books, the 100 Years' War was ultimately decided by ordinary people who chose, day after agonizing day, whether to endure just a little longer or to surrender and live. The world of mercenaries in the 100 Years' War wasn't just a sideshow. It was a blood-soaked carnival where loyalty dissolved into gold. These hired blades, known as routiers or free companies, didn't fight for crowns or causes. They fought for the weight of a purse, and their battles were less about glory than survival. Picture a Breton village at dawn, its fields trampled by armored men speaking half a dozen tongues, their banners bearing no heraldry but the scars of a dozen employers. When these mercenaries clashed with local militias, it wasn't the choreographed violence of knightly combat. It was knife work in the dark, ambushes in narrow lanes, and barns set ablaze to smoke out defenders. What made these duels so chilling was their intimacy. Unlike the grand confrontations at Crécy or Agincourt, where armies followed the distant drums of kings, routier warfare was personal. A farmer-turned-militiaman might recognize the mercenary burning his crops as the same man who drank at his tavern months earlier under a different lord's pay. The free companies, often composed of deserters from both sides, developed a culture of ruthless pragmatism. They pioneered tactics THAT Chinese letter armies deemed dishonorable, holding bridges for tolls, torturing villagers to reveal hidden grain stores, or selling their services to besiegers and besieged in the same week. Their reputation for brutality became legendary. Chroniclers told of the Tarred Venus Company, who crucified a captured knight upside down as a warning, or the infamous archpriest Arnaud's band, who wore stolen church vestments into battle as macabre jokes. But what truly set them apart was their mobility. While royal armies bogged down in sieges, mercenary bands struck like lightning, pillaging a monastery here, extorting a merchant convoy there, always staying one step ahead of retribution. Yet for all their savagery, the routiers were also products of a broken system. Many were veterans left unpaid by bankrupt lords, turning to freelance work to avoid starvation. The war had chewed them up and spat them out, and their violence was as much a symptom of the conflict's chaos as its cause. When they fought local militias, it wasn't just predator versus prey. It was two desperate sides scrapping over scraps in a war that had forgotten them both. By the war's end, the mercenaries' legacy was written in scorched earth and emptied coffers. Both England and France would eventually turn on them, hunting down the very men they'd once hired. But their shadow war left an indelible mark, proving that when kingdoms fail to control their monsters, those monsters rewrite the rules of the game. In the smoke-choked chaos of the 100 Years' War, where kingdoms clashed and blood soaked the soil, another duel raged, one fought not with steel, but with scripture. This was the age when heaven and earth blurred, when kings ruled by divine right but peasants whispered of saints walking among them. Nowhere was this spiritual battleground more vividly drawn than in the story of Joan of Arc, the illiterate farm girl who knelt in her father's garden and heard voices that would topple thrones. Her visions of Saint Michael and Saint Catherine weren't just private revelations. They became political dynamite, proof that God might speak through a peasant's lips as easily as a cardinal's. But Joan was far from the only celestial player in this drama. The war's very legitimacy hinged on competing claims of divine sanction. English kings swore their right to France was God's will, citing prophecies and omens with the fervor of priests. Henry V carried relics into battle at Agincourt, while his chaplains preached that victory would prove England's heavenly mandate. Across the field, French bishops denounced the invaders as heretics, rallying their flocks with tales of English soldiers desecrating altars. Even the weather became theological when storms sank English supply ships. French heralds called it divine retribution. When dysentery ravaged French camps, English archers saw it as proof of their righteousness. The church itself was no mere spectator in this holy war. Cardinals brokered truces with one hand while funding armies with the other. In Avignon, rival popes excommunicated each other's supporters, turning excommunication into a weapon as lethal as any longbow. At the Council of Constance in 1417, where Europe's princes gathered to heal the papal schism, the 100 Years' War shadowed every debate. French and English delegates nearly came to blows over which nation's saints deserved more veneration. Religion wasn't just part of the conflict, it was the lens through which every defeat and victory was interpreted. Yet beneath the grand narratives of divine favor, faith also thrived in the war's cracks and shadows. Common soldiers on both sides carried prayer books sewn into their tunics, while besieged towns processed with relics to beg heavenly intervention. The war birthed new cults of martyrs, like the 6 burghers of Calais, whose sacrifice was painted as Christ-like redemption. Even mercenaries, those godless sellswords, paid lip service to piety. Many free companies kept chaplains on payroll to absolve their sins between raids. The cruelest irony lay in how easily holy fervor could curdle into horror. Joan's eventual capture and trial at Rouen exposed the dark flip side of medieval faith. The same church that canonized mystics could burn them as heretics when politics demanded. Her English captors didn't just want her dead, they needed her discredited, her voices recanted as demonic lies. The trial transcripts reveal less about theology than realpolitik, with bishops and earls alike twisting scripture to justify a foregone conclusion. What makes this spiritual duel so haunting is its unresolved tension. Both sides genuinely believed God marched in their ranks, yet the war ground on for generations without clear heavenly verdict. Perhaps that's why Joan's legend endured, not because she ended the war, but because she embodied its central paradox. In an age where faith could crown kings or light pyres, the line between saint and sinner, between divine will and human ambition, was as thin as the edge of a sword and just as sharp. The Hundred Years' War never truly ended, it simply shape-shifted, trading swords for quills and battlefields for bookshelves. Long after the last arrow found its mark, the conflict raged on in the pages of chronicles, the verses of poets, and eventually the flickering frames of cinema. This final duel wasn't fought with steel but with stories, as England and France waged a quieter war over who would control the past. For the English, the war became a tapestry of heroic myth, woven with threads from Agincourt and Crecy. Shakespeare's Henry V immortalized the conflict as a tale of plucky underdogs, his St. Crispin's Day speech turning muddy butchery into rousing patriotism. Never mind that the real Henry executed prisoners and starved civilians. The bard's version was a golden-haired conqueror, his victories proof of divine favor. Even today, English schoolchildren recite, "We few, we happy few," their voices echoing a nationalism forged in those blood-soaked fields. The war's English memory is a selective one, where longbowmen stand tall and inconvenient sieges like Orléans fade into the footnotes. France, meanwhile, spun its own legend from the wreckage. Joan of Arc's transformation from heretic to saint became the ultimate redemption arc, her martyrdom proof that God had chosen France after all. Chroniclers like Froissart painted French defeats as noble sacrifices, their knights charging to glorious ruin rather than admitting tactical blunders. Over centuries, this narrative hardened into national identity. The war wasn't a failure but a crucible, forging France's eventual unity under kings like Charles VII. Where England celebrated battles, France venerated perseverance, turning starvation sieges and peasant revolts into symbols of unbreakable spirit. Modern media sharpened these competing myths into pop culture weapons. Hollywood's The King, 2019, served up Agincourt as a gritty underdog story, while French films like Jeanne, 2019, framed Joan's journey as mystical feminism. Video games like A Plague Tale used the war as a haunting backdrop, its rats and ruin mirroring the era's trauma. Even tourism plays its part. Visit Agincourt's museum, and you'll hear French guides emphasize the betrayal of Burgundian allies, cross the Channel to the Tower of London, and the emphasis shifts to English ingenuity. The war's afterlife reveals an uncomfortable truth. History belongs not to those who lived it, but to those who reshape it. Legends like the Black Prince and Joan of Arc have become hollow vessels, filled and refilled with whatever values a generation needs. The Hundred Years' War's final victory wasn't won with cannons or treaties, but in the quiet moments when a child opens a textbook, a tourist gazes at a monument, or a filmmaker frames a shot, each one unknowingly choosing a side in a duel that never really ends. The fields of France and England may have fallen silent, but the Hundred Years' War's true impact was only just beginning to unfold. This wasn't a duel of swords or sieges, it was a clash of legacies, where the war's aftershocks reshaped the very fabric of Europe. On the surface, the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475 drew a line under the conflict, yet the real transformation happened far from negotiation tables. Feudalism, that centuries-old system of knights and serfs bound by oaths, crumbled under the weight of the war's innovations. Armies were no longer raised through personal loyalties but paid for with royal treasuries. Kings, not lords, became the focal point of power, their authority cemented by the very taxes that funded their campaigns. The war didn't just change borders, it birthed the modern state. England emerged with a fractured sense of identity. The loss of continental territories forced a reckoning. What did it mean to be English without French lands? The answer crystallized around symbols like the longbow, once a tool of war, now a national emblem of resilience. Archery practice became law, mandated by royal decree, weaving martial pride into everyday life. Yet this pride was bittersweet. The war's cost had drained the treasury and exposed the limits of English ambition. The dream of a dual monarchy was dead, replaced by an inward focus that would eventually fuel the island's maritime empire. England didn't win the war, but it survived, and in survival found a new path. France, by contrast, emerged reforged. The chaos of invasion had unintentionally unified a fractured kingdom. Charles VII reforms a standing army, centralized taxation, and the marginalization of rebellious nobles laid the groundwork for absolute monarchy. Joan of Arc's martyrdom became a rallying cry, transforming her from a heretic into a saintly symbol of French destiny. Where England celebrated individual triumphs like Agincourt, France venerated collective endurance. The war's devastation birthed a paradox. The more territory France lost, the stronger its national identity became. By the time the last English troops sailed home, France wasn't just a kingdom, it was an idea, one that could survive future revolutions and invasions alike. Yet the war's deepest legacy wasn't political, it was cultural. The rivalry seeped into art, language, and even cuisine. French chroniclers painted the English as barbarians, while English ballads mocked French cowardice in verse. This wasn't just propaganda, it was the birth of national stereotypes that still linger today. The war also democratized heroism. Figures like Dugesclin and the Black Prince became folk legends, their stories told in taverns as often as courts. Warfare itself had been stripped of its chivalric pretenses, revealing a brutal truth. Victory favored not the noblest but the most adaptable. So who truly won? Perhaps the answer lies not in crowns or treaties, but in the silent revolutions the war ignited. The longbow's dominance hastened the decline of the mounted knight, just as gunpowder at Castillon heralded the end of medieval warfare altogether. The conflict's financial demands birthed early banking systems, while its sieges spurred advances in engineering. Even the concept of France and England as unified nations was, in part, a byproduct of decades spent defining themselves against each other. The 100 Years' War was less a contest of kings than a catalyst, an explosion that scattered its fragments across centuries, shaping everything from national borders to the way we remember courage itself. In the end, the greatest duel wasn't fought on any battlefield, but in the unending struggle to decide what the war would mean and who gets to tell its story. The 100 Years' War's greatest duels weren't just measured in bloodshed or battlefield victories, they were collisions of human ambition so fierce they reshaped the world. Think of Edward the Black Prince staring down King John at Poitiers, not just as enemies, but as men whose choices would echo for generations. Or Joan of Arc, a teenager armed with nothing but conviction, facing down the might of England's war machine. These weren't clashes of faceless armies, they were personal, raw, and dripping with stakes we can still feel today. What makes these rivalries timeless isn't the armor or the arrows, it's the moments when history hinged on a single decision, a burst of courage, or a fatal miscalculation. Consider the deeper currents beneath these conflicts. When Henry V gambled everything at Agincourt, he wasn't just fighting French knights, he was challenging an entire worldview that said birthright trumped merit. Bertrand and Dugesclin's guerrilla campaigns didn't just win battles, they proved that innovation could outmuscle tradition. Even the bitter feud between the Armagnacs and Burgundians revealed a universal truth: the most destructive wars are often the ones we fight against ourselves. These stories resonate because they're not relics, they're mirrors. The same ambitions, rivalries, and leaps of faith that defined the 100 Years' War still drive our world today, just with different costumes. As the dust settled, the war left behind more than shifted borders. It forged nations, redefined power, and even changed how we think about war itself. The longbow's dominance at Crecy heralded the end of the knight's invincibility, just as the cannons at Castillon signaled warfare's grim future. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the reminder that history isn't some inevitable force. It's the sum of countless human choices, each as fragile and potent as the people who made them. So as we close this chapter, here's a question to carry forward. If you could witness one of these duels firsthand, which would it be? Would you stand in the mud at Agincourt, feeling the air hum with arrows? Or watch Joan of Arc rally broken soldiers at Orléans, her voice cutting through the despair? The past is alive with these moments, waiting to be rediscovered. Share your pick in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. For more journeys into history's heart, hit subscribe, because the greatest stories aren't just in books. They're in the echoes we still hear today. Until next time, keep chasing those echoes. The past, after all, is never really past.